Hello, and welcome to The Next Consumer Change, our latest Clear conversation presented in partnership with our friends at TML Partners. My name is Geraint Jones. I'm Clear MNC Saatchi's Global Marketing Director, and I'll be your host today. It's great to see some old friends and new joining us for today's conversation. From Reckitt to PepsiCo, to Diageo, to Procter & Gamble. We've got a wide range of consumer goods brand leaders in the audience today, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the show. As an attendee, just to make sure that you know this, your camera and your microphone are automatically off, and you will not be able to turn them on accidentally, so you can relax, and if you're in the UK, be comfortable with your nerves in advance of the big game at 5 p.m. The session is being recorded and shared currently on our YouTube channel at Clear MNC Saatchi and also on our LinkedIn page, and we will put the links to those channels in the chat function at the bottom of your screen. For more content, events, and to watch recordings of this and other future conversations and past conversations, please do visit clearstrategy.com/events, and we'll put the link to that in the comments box as well. Should you wish to ask a question of our wonderful panel, please do use the Q&A function in the bar at the bottom of the screen and start your question with the name of the panelist you'd like to answer if relevant. So for example, type Yelena if you'd like Yelena to answer your question. Right, let's get on with this then, shall we? So Clear is the growth consulting arm of the MNC Saatchi Group, and we have found ourselves in the thick of helping brands to manage the chaos that the last 18 months has brought with it. From future scenario planning to rapid agile innovation, category innovation and strategy to portfolio management, brand repositioning to proposition redevelopment. We've rather been asked to help brands in a number of sectors to navigate through the choppy waters of marketing strategy in the last 18 months. And in amongst all of that, the key questions that we keep hearing from the start of the pandemic to today are, what's happening with consumer behavior in category X? Is change Y permanent or temporary? And how can I stay ahead of the next big consumer change? Every single brand marketer on the planet in every sector was asking pretty much the same question. And in a world of constant change, how do we stay ahead of it and find the competitive advantage we're all looking for? What this has also created is a seemingly insatiable desire for consumer insight at every level, and particularly at the highest levels of every organization we work with. It's dawned on our senior leaders that the key to survive and grow was in the hands of the marketing department all along, and suddenly marketers were being listened to like never before. We've spoken to so many CMOs and senior leaders in the marketing space who have found themselves in the boardroom far more regularly than perhaps they had in the previous few years. But now, as we look forward to summer, hopefully with some more freedoms, that tricky question is back again. What happens next? To unpick this pretty tricky challenge, we're partnering once more with our friends at TML Partners, and Emma Calder, Senior Consultant at TML, is going to talk a little bit about them and our partnership before she hands over to Steve Lang, a director at Clear, who will talk and walk through some of our thinking on the topic of consumer behavioural shifts, before we then get on to debate those big questions with our fabulous panel. And I'm delighted to welcome, firstly, Yelena Idelchik, Category Management and Shopper Insights Director for Hygiene US at Reckitt. Yelena has 25 years of shopper insights and category management experience across top FMCG and CPG companies and categories. She started her career in brand management with Mondelez and Colgate-Palmolive, and later leading category management and insights teams at Coty Beauty and most recently at Reckitt. She navigates change and drives actionable insights across Reckitt's hygiene and health categories, and considers herself a navigator of change, so perfect for today, believing that if you stay still, you manage, but if you are going somewhere and adapting, you lead. Good words to live by, I think. We're also joined by Michael Benson, who is Marketing Director at Church & Dwight in the UK. Michael is works at Church & Dwight, one of the world's fastest growing CPG and FMCG companies, and he joined them 7 years ago and works with an expanding portfolio of health and beauty brands. He's served as a director on both the client and agency side across numerous consumer brands, services and markets in the last 25 years. And this is his second appearance on A Clear Conversation, so welcome back, Michael. We're also joined by Megan Frakowiak, who is Director of Category Management at Sovos Brands. With over 15 years of retail and manufacturing experience, Megan has spent the better part of her career tracking and reacting to consumer behaviors and trends. At Sovos, the home of popular brands like Noosa and Rouse, Her and the team have been hyper-focused on quickly identifying and responding to the shifting needs of today's consumers, which has never been more important or pertinent. We're also joined from Clear by Stephen Lang, who is a strategy director at Clear FMCG Saatchi. He's got particular expertise in brand and growth strategy, helping clients to bring their brands to life inside and outside of their companies. At Clear, he's led multinational engagements for a range of B2B and B2C clients, including Invesco, John Lewis, Nestle, and Colgate-Palmolive. Before Clear, he spent 6 years at the global brand consultancy, The Clearing, no relation. And finally, we're joined by Emma Calder. Emma is a senior consultant at TML Partners and who focuses on senior marketing appointments for leading and high growth brands across the CPG and FMCG space, as well as retail and the e-com sectors. Prior to TML, Emma had spent 4 years with a boutique CPG and FMCG recruitment firm, building on her previous 16 years in international brand consumer and marketing roles for Colgate-Palmolive and Kerry Foods. So Emma, I'm going to hand to you now. Why don't you explain a little bit more about the partnership between TML and Clear FMCG Saatchi before Steve gets us going on the discussion?
Sure. Thanks very much, Geraint. So yes, I work as part of TML Partners, and we're delighted to be continuing our partnership with Clear on these webinar events. I think this is my third event, but as a business, TML Partners have partnered on many more sessions, and we cover all sorts of different marketing sectors and topics. So as I say, I personally look after our FMCG and retail division. I'm really pleased to be co-hosting this afternoon. I wanted to give a thank you in advance to Yelena, to Megan, and to Michael for joining us on the panel, and of course for being invited to co-host Geraint. I'm now going to hand over to Stephen, who's going to set the scene for the conversation.
Great, thanks Emma. Okay. Let me share my screen. Okay, so just a few thoughts from me to kick off the debate and discussion, which I'm sure will be a really interesting one. Now, where did this conversation come from? Well, if you can sort of cast your minds back to March last year, when we had this incredible moment when everyone was panic buying toilet paper, and for a strange time, it was a regular topic of conversation about where you could find this amidst the sort of stripped shelves and empty stores. Fortunately, as you can see in the article on the right-hand side there, the Wall Street Journal declared a couple months back, Americans now have too much toilet paper and sales have slowed. Perhaps unsurprisingly, definitely a good thing. I think this got us thinking, kind of, as Geraint said, it's not just toilet paper. Many CPG categories have been affected positively and negatively over the past 16 months. Baking products, vitamins and supplements, fresh coffee, dishwasher detergents, not to mention disinfectant wipes, have all performed very well at various points during the pandemic. Contrastingly, kind of makeup and beauty, fragrances, gum and candy have all struggled for a good part of the past year. We're now seeing a reset within a lot of these numbers. A lot of the sales figures are being sort of reversed, and it sort of led us to the question of, well, as Geraint said, what next? But more importantly, perhaps, is there anything that brands can do to either sort of mitigate against the inevitable decline that's going to come from those good sales, or actually boost growth as their category rebounds over the next months and years? So that's where this came from. I want to start just by saying quite obviously that it is a very big question when you talk about what next. We can't predict the future. Nobody can do that. But what we can do is we can look at the past and we can learn from it. And having studied history a very long time ago in my undergraduate degree, I do subscribe to that idea that actually the more you sort of think about the past, the better prepared you are for the future. So with that in mind, what we've done is just go back to the last 16, 17 months of consumer behavior change. What's actually happened? What are the stages that consumers have gone through? And importantly, what can brands learn from that? And I think what we have seen and summarized here is kind of like 4 stages of behavior change, each of which I think presents a lesson for brands to move forward with post-pandemic. So stage 1, retreat. Again, go back to March last year, as painful as that may be in many ways. And what happened to consumer behavior? I think what we saw was a mass retreat to the home. So shelves were stripped, pantries were stocked, and amidst that sort of fear and uncertainty and panic in many ways at the time, arose this sort of consumer need for comfort and for security. And big established brands, those kind of very familiar favorites, were rediscovered. I think Spam saw incredible growth in sales. Campbell's Soup, another brand that had similar sort of positive performance, as well as meeting a functional need, i.e. for sort of long-lasting food. They also tapped into that emotional need that consumers were looking for. They're brands that have been there, that have been through it all and survived, and sort of will continue to be there no matter what. So what's the lesson? What does it mean when we think about the future? I think it's a very basic one, actually, which is just to remember and know how your audience perceives you and what functional and emotional needs you can really deliver against, because having that clarity can help you capitalize on any future shift in consumer need and behavior. So second stage, what else happened that we can learn from? What we've called discover. So if sort of familiarity and comfort in big brands shone through at the beginning of the pandemic, I think fairly soon afterwards, what we saw was a significant period of trial and discovery. So what this chart on the right-hand side shows is the sort of relative sales performance of large CPGs against small manufacturers. And what you see is, you see that bump for large CPGs at the beginning of the pandemic, but then sort of very quickly reverses to smaller brands taking over and doing pretty well. Why? I think various reasons, in part out of stock issues, in part sort of continued acceleration of e-commerce and the sort of breadth of opportunity offered by online shopping, and in part due to sort of sheer boredom, stuck at home, perhaps with a bit of extra cash in the pocket. Consumers decided to make the best of it, to sort of adopt new behaviors and trial brands that fit into them. So what's the lesson? Again, looking forward, I think that change in consumer context creates opportunities, but to take advantage, brands need to be able to sort of be nimble enough to adapt and flex tactics quickly, whether that's products, distribution, marketing, to sort of build that physical and mental availability. Third stage, scrutinize. And I think this is an acceleration of a pre-existing consumer trend around sort of the increasing expectation that brands play a positive role in society, and the increasing scrutiny of the actions of brands outside of just creating products and delivering profit. So there's plenty of statistics around this. Everyone talks about millennials in particular seeking out brands that align with their values, and also sort of even boycotting brands that don't. I think what we've seen in the past 18 months or so is in part due to the pandemic, in part due to sort of Black Lives Matter and everything that's come around that increased level of scrutiny in brands to sort of deliver against what they say they're going to make that positive contribution. I think there's a great quote on the right-hand side from Connie Brams at Unilever on this at the back end of the year, saying, people will be living and looking in recession times to brands for their value, but also their values. And it's that dual nature of value that's become more prominent. Simple lesson from this as we think forward, I think, know what you stand for, what you value as a brand, but importantly, what you're prepared to stand up for and the actions that you're prepared to take in line with that. And then our last change and lesson. So we've called evolve. In short, I think as that toilet paper sales statistic showed at the beginning, consumers have already moved on to an extent. This isn't a big shift that's about to happen. These changes are already happening, have already happened for a long time. People are back out of the home, trade-offs are being made. And as we can see from some of those statistics on the right-hand side of this slide, some of these new behaviors will stick, some of them will be dropped. The big question is which and why, I suppose. I was reading a great article in Marketing Week by behavioral scientist Helena Rubinstein about this last week, talking about using sort of behavior change principles to determine which new behaviors will stick based around key questions, such as, have people had time to build a habit? Have they had opportunity to sustain that? Have new social norms been created? But importantly, and perhaps most importantly, are people motivated to continue that behavior? So I think when we think about the lesson for brands, again, looking forward, for me, it comes down to utility. So finding ways to be valuable, to continue to be useful. Those new products, those new services, or even new use cases for your brand that have developed over the past 16 months or so, are they still going to be useful now the context has changed? And if not, how can you evolve to continue to be more useful and meet those sort of new evolving needs? So this last point for me to launch into the discussion is that, whilst we can look back to draw lessons, as I've just walked through. I think one of the other things we need to be conscious of is that there are so many sort of forces for change impacting future consumer behavior. We wrote a piece back in January called Chaos to Clarity, talking about how organizations can harness and navigate these forces of chaos that are impacting their business. Point being that there are so many of them, and some of these have been really accelerated over the past year or so. This is just a sample that I think are quite important. I mean, to tack off a couple of them, the burgeoning wealth divide. If we think about what's happened over the past year or so, a lot's been written about this, that the wealth gap that was existent in our society has got bigger. The sort of recovery is expected to sort of be two-speed in a way. People that have kept their jobs tend to be the ones that had a bit more money in the first place. They benefited from property prices, from a stock market resurgence, and the opposite is true at the other end of the scale. Obvious implications for brand and marketing. And the new world of work as well. When we think about CPG brands, are people going back to the office? Where are they going to be? When and how often? I think these questions are still very much being debated. And that has obvious impact around sort of distribution and product and marketing strategy. So when we think about what next, one of the phrases, which I'm sure everybody's sick of at this point, is the new normal. I don't think there is one at all. In fact, it's just about constant change and evolution, and the question becomes more about sort of how do we stay ahead, adapt quickly, and navigate that change in order to drive growth. So with that, I will hand back over to Grant to throw out some questions.
Thank you, Steve. So we're going to kick off the questions for each of our panelists. I should say at this point, we've received a number of questions from our audience in advance, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the hour. But if you do have a burning question, please ask it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will try and make time for it. And please remember to put the name of the panelist that you'd like to answer it with your question. So, Yelena, I'm going to come to you first with probably the biggest question of the whole panel. Is it really possible to stay ahead of behavioral change?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody in the audience today for inviting us to the panel. Probably, I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that we do not have a crystal ball, and there are multiple variables that can make our world and behavior pivot. However, we can prepare to anticipate what can happen through ideating on the most likely outcomes and preparing what-if scenarios based on what we know about the shopper reactions. So naturally, the trends and behaviors we were anticipating early in the pandemic compressed to 5 years, from 5 years to about 1. And as such, we have to be able to pivot and react much faster. But the best part is that because the situation is not as predictable, our retail partners are listening to us much more at each level, whether or not it's top to top or at the sales meetings, and are more open to the new ideas and ways of acting and building mutual trust. What we typically would do is ideate on the scenarios, but also identify what are the beacons along the way that allow us to indicate that one or the other scenario is playing out. And I think when you predict that, or at least define this, it makes the situation place you more in control as opposed to somebody who is in the reactionary position. Yes,
I think that scenario planning muscle that we've all built out over the last 18 months, if you didn't have it before, is pretty much here to stay, isn't it? It's a requirement now for marketers to be able to think about multiple different outcomes and plan for them and move very quickly to address changes that suggest one scenario or the other is going to be better or worse. To help you with that, Michael, what are the sort of forward and backward looking tools that you're using most when looking to understand consumer behavior today? Have you added new things to your suite of tools, or are you sort of going along with old favorites?
A bit of both, actually. So in terms of tools, we have used traditional panel data to give us some really hard metrics to see how has lockdown impacted our consumers, impacted their shopping behavior, and it is possible to predict what's going to happen next, because we've seen across a number of our brands, as we've gone into lockdown, certain changes have happened as we've come out of lockdown. Certainly, those changes have reversed to a degree. So we've got a pretty good idea across some of the brands what's going to be happening next. So we've been using that panel data. We've been also correlating that with what we're seeing happening in terms of the shop emissions and the way that the different channels have been impacted by the lockdown. And so that's really helped us plan ahead. What's been interesting in terms of more forward-looking, so that's looking in the rearview mirror. More forward-looking, we have been conducting qualitative research and doing a lot of social listening to try and understand, okay, so how are people now using our different categories going forward? How are they seeing them fit into their lives slightly differently than they have been so far? And that's been able to help us then really begin to predict, okay, so perhaps the occasions we thought that consumption happened in the past are not going to be so important in the future. So that's allowing us to plan ahead. So yeah, a bit of both.
A bit of both. We've had a question from the audience already. Thank you, Isabel. Just to follow up on that, Michael, how much academic research do you incorporate into your decision-making process to inform decisions?
Academic research, so as in looking at research truly from academia, or are you thinking just private research?
I think academic research is the question. So anything that's being brought in from academia, I think it may be in reference, although I may be wrong, but it may be in reference into the fact that I think a lot of us were looking at the beginning of the pandemic to academic research about bounce back from an economic perspective and from a spend perspective after big shocks, big exogenous shocks. Have you been using anything like that to help inform strategy? And if any of the other panelists want to jump in on this as well, please do.
Yeah, we have. We've been, looking at quite a lot of the traditional publications and seeing what they're saying about what sort of recovery we think we're going to have, how consumers responded to past recoveries. So that provides colour, I suppose, to the more detailed research that we're focusing on in our categories. So we do look at it, but we don't rely on it because they are so macro, if you see what I mean. So we really need to understand how consumers are using our products. Has the role of our category now and the products within that changed in people's lives at this time?
Megan, I'm going to come to you next. You seem to have your own thoughts as well.
Absolutely. So just to build on what Michael just said, at the beginning of the pandemic and the beginning of lockdown, I think academic research was vital because it's pretty much all we had, right? No one really knew what was going on and everyone was trying to figure it out at the same time. So looking at recovery curves from past recessions and past pandemics, past health crises, what was all we had, right? And it gave great direction at that point. But I think in that now that consumers have a better beat and a better feel for what's happening around them and they form their own opinion, consumer insights and surveys have been like our lifeline, and having consumer awareness and a good idea of what they're thinking in the now has been really a guiding principle over anything else.
Have you added any other approaches or changes to the way you've done insight and strategy since the start of the pandemic, Megan? Have you added in behavioral data from digital channels, for example?
We're very focused on brick and mortar. Yelena said something previously about the retailer relationship, and I can't emphasize that enough, right? It's evolving dramatically. So that's been our primary focus because we have a responsibility to our retail partners as well as our consumers to be there for them in this time of crisis, right, throughout the pandemic. And that's been our guiding light the entire time. When supply was really low, we made sure that that was right. But now everyone's asking the questions that we're talking about today, including the top retailers out there, right? And like Yelena said, we're the ones at the table having those discussions and helping them jointly as a partnership form, how do they form their strategies and how are we a part of that?
Yeah, it's a super interesting point. We had Abigail Posner from Google's brand unit on one of these, I think midsummer last year, maybe late summer. And she was talking about retail partnerships and primarily how those retailers have woken up to the power of all of the data that they have to their hands, but more importantly, how specific they're getting in the requests that they need answered by that data and how much they're asking of their partners, both in the digital space, but also in the category space, to come back with answers at scale and at speed to help them make very fast decisions that can take advantage of very fast moving market conditions. I assume that's sort of what you're talking about, that kind of need to be a partner, but also a much more fast moving partner than perhaps you have been in the past.
Very nimble, right? Nimble and being able to pivot as fast as our consumers' feelings and emotions are pivoting, so that we're there to suit their needs. Absolutely.
I can see you nodding, Yelena. I'm assuming it's been similar at Reckitt. You've been doing the same in terms of guiding your partners and retail partners in particular.
Most certainly. And I think that there are so many questions, and there are so many questions in the moment. We know, for example, that in the past, shoppers were, staying at home and maybe hoarding a little bit and, cleaning too much. And of course, the questions that are on everybody's mind, for example, for the makers, of us being the makers of Lysol and Finish and Airwick, how will this behavior stick? How much will shoppers use and how quickly of what they may have hoarded? And how much will they continue to disinfect, for example, not because they need to clean, but because they need to protect their health? And all this is obviously changing so much with 8 and 10 now leaving their home daily. And will they, again, preserve that behavior? So buyers are asking us this, how we optimize our portfolios will depend on this as well, and really understanding. So what Megan was saying, that in the moment research, the social listening, the ability to use completely new tools to dive into those details and understand them pretty much instantaneously, as opposed to relying on more traditional usage and attitude studies or path to purchase studies, is paramount.
I think that's a really important point. Now, I'm going to come to you next, Michael, because we talked a little bit now about how we get the handle on change, how we kind of array the different tools and techniques to get ourselves into a position where we're informed, or at least better informed than we were. How do we manage it now? We're in the middle of it. And I remember talking to you last year, and you were saying, there was an understandable focus on the tactical, particularly as you have such an array of brands at Church & Dwight. There were some brands that fundamentally we're doing very well out of the crisis, but others that we're doing not so well as a result of, being in a different consumption area. So have you had the time to step back and really look strategically at what comes next? Have you been able to get the head up and think long term?
Yeah, very much so. I think we've never really taken our eye off the long term. Obviously, the short term has been all consuming when we're planning and replanning. But never really taken our eye off the long term, because many of the category growth driver fundamentals haven't fundamentally changed. It's just the way that consumers potentially are accessing those categories, and where we've then had to look at, okay, so in the short term as opposed to the long term, what do we have to do differently when it comes to our channels and our channel partners? So conversation that Yelena and Megan have just been talking about is really, really important. But for our consumers, what's the right messaging that we need to be putting out there to affect change in this environment with their new priorities? And and how can we help them in today's life? The growth drivers fundamentally aren't changed, so it's those short-term tactics that we've had to rework to achieve our longer-term goals. So, some categories had to do the replan. We had to look at the different usage occasions are going to change, the ways people's lives have changed, and the ways of working are changing. So, at-home usage, at-home beauty, where you can't go to the salons anymore. That is still going to be a fundamental part of life going forward. The question is how much of that is going to be the case. Because the other thing we mustn't forget that there are still many people for whom working at home isn't an option. And so when we start talking about different lives and the working from home phenomenon, that's going to impact some, but not all. And they will be going back to some of the previous behaviors. So we're getting that balance right, but we've never taken our eye off the long term, because the fundamentals are the same. It's just how we get there are going to be slightly different in this time.
Yeah, you made a really interesting and I think important point for this audience in that sort of answer there, which is that not everybody has been working from home. Not everyone's been lucky enough to be in the position where they're able to. There was a fabulous, I hate them, by the way. I don't like these LinkedIn surveys that we're all getting, as this panel already knows. But there was a brilliant one, which was what percentage of the UK population worked from home in the peak of the pandemic. And it only went out to this person's audience of marketers, and it was specifically targeted at people in the marketing industry. And 70-something% was the answer that everyone came back with, and the reality was 43. So there is a huge dissonance, I guess, between what we as an industry tend to believe because of what we experience, and the need to therefore really focus back onto the data, onto the insight about real consumers who are buying our products, because the experience that we've potentially, most of us have had, is very different to the experience that the majority of our consumers have had. So I think it's a hugely important point. Emma, has that sort of focus on strategy and that focus more on the long term and that focus on looking at innovation in different angles, has that kind of come through into the recruitment world as well? Are you seeing changes in the way that people are building out their marketing teams?
Yeah, certainly. I would say there's certainly been an increase in roles around customer experience, for example, whether that's online or in store as the world opens up again. So I guess companies and brands that have acquired a lot of online customers during the pandemic are now maybe in a slightly more luxurious position of being able to explore in more detail who those consumers are and who those shoppers are. So there's definitely an increase in roles around customer experience and the need for performance marketing specialists and behavior analysts who are going to deep dive into the customer data, conduct segmentation studies and analyze purchase behavior. And I guess from the other perspective as well, in terms of sort of engaging with consumers a bit more, there's an increased demand for talented sort of CRM and content specialists for really sort of targeted, personalized communications as well. So I was just saying there's some early observations and changes in the market this year.
Yeah, it's super interesting because obviously what you see is the need that sits in the marketplace. And, you know, we've been speaking to marketers for the entirety of this last sort of 15 months or so. Many mentioned that they quickly found out that they had too many ideas, too many potential calls on their time and projects for them to be truly effective. And so what they were desperately looking for really was a way of stripping out the things that were not important to focus on and instead be choiceful about the things that they did spend time, money, investment, and recruitment dollars on. So, Megan, how did you use your understanding of the evolving consumer behavior shift to make those hard choices on what to focus on and what not to focus on?
Choiceful is the key word. And the conversation that was just happening, we've been super focused on regionality, right? So Michael's return to salon is the equivalent of our return to restaurant. And that's clearly impacting the world in two different ways, right? It's impacting by geography, by state, by location, as well as the economic diversity, like you were speaking about in the opening slides, right? There are people who are willing to go out and pay more to go to their restaurants, and there are people who are not. But at the same time, there are people who are sitting in New York and they have tons of options still. And then there are people sitting in very rural United States where their two pizzerias within a 20-mile radius have shut down during this pandemic and they don't have choices anymore, right? So targeting, being choiceful with our dollars and our projects, everything has to have a very specific purpose, but still within on those what if scenarios, right? So it's almost like a new level, exponential level on top of on strategic planning that we have to pay attention to now.
Steve, you talked in your little presentation about our study From Chaos to Clarity that we published in January. In that, we tasked ourselves with helping marketers solving that specific choicefulness question, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. It's a really difficult question, isn't it? Because I think at the moment there's so many things that you could be doing, so many things competing for your attention and for your budget and your dollar spend. The other thing that we talked about was around kind of when you're thinking about the long term, also like what trends do you need to focus on? What are the big forces coming up that are going to impact your business, and maybe what do you not need to focus on? What can you leave to the side? And I think that, you know, the way that we thought about it at the time and mapped out in the report is kind of assessing things on a few different dimensions, right? So the size of each of the potential impacts on your business. You think of each of these forces, how big an effect could that have? What's the time horizon, short term, medium term, long term, and also what's your ability to sort of influence that and control it? To what extent do you can you do anything about it, and do your consumers or your partners want you to? And then building the strategy that takes all of that into account. So sort of looking at short term, medium term, long term, where are our quick wins, but also where's our sort of strategic focus areas, and to Michael's point earlier, kind of where are our long-term transformational bets, right? Because you can't sort of take your eye off that at the same time. So sort of trying to balance everything.
Yeah, it's such an important sort of task to go through. It's just finding the time as a marketer to do it. From personal experience, you look at all of these different things and you're running at 100 million miles an hour to keep up. But having the kind of the discipline to sit down with a model like that and actually plan out your time more effectively and plan out, in effect, the investments that your business is going to make in its growth is such an important thing to do. I mean, I think the challenge we're all facing is that, to Steve's point, change is pretty much constant. And I think there's a myth again that COVID is the only change that's happening right now. COVID is an accelerator in a lot of ways. It's an accelerator. It's a catalyst, but it's not the only massive structural change that's going on in multiple segments around the world, from the enormous shift to electrification, which will have its own cascading impacts on how we commute or don't commute to work. There's so much happening that we all have to be aware of and keep our perspectives on. Having some sort of model to give you some structure, I think, is a really important thing. Let's come on to you now, Yelena, because I think one of the things that we also saw in this process about getting a handle on change was this rapid mushrooming of really smart, really effective brand partnerships. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Dettol and Lysol's partnership with Hilton, because I think it's a great example of brands using context, brand trust that you've built up in each other's brands, and also the behavioral changes that are going on in the market to their advantage. It's tempting, having had that success, to look at other out-of-home occasions that your brand can access. How are you choosing at Reckitt which ones to pursue, which ones not to, and how do you select your partners?
I think it's a really interesting philosophical question. And I think I would say that the filter through which we're looking at this is to make sure that these solutions and these partnerships are feasible, ownable, and sustainable. And we'll look at our internal capacity, of course, but also how well are these partnerships fit with our equity at both the brand and corporate level, and how long they can last and grow, both as our partnerships and as the future marketplace evolves. So we always look at this as 2 + 2 has to equal 5. And that is why those relationships with Hilton and Amazon, right, and Delta and many others that are already sealed or are in the works will only continue to proliferate. And the reason for that is that we as individuals want to mitigate risk. And if we, with our brand equity, can prove to the shoppers that this is the right for them and not a privilege to be protected, this is when we can make it a little bit more accessible and also drive that mutual trust.
It's a really interesting thing, this partnerships thing. I think it's a source of growth that I think we all happened on during the pandemic, and actually it's one that I think is becoming more and more important. Michael, how much of a role do you think these innovative cross-category partnerships will have on your ability at Church & Dwight for all of your brands to stay relevant and access new growth as we get back out into the world outside our homes?
Yeah, I think it's going to be more relevant for some than others. So when we start thinking about our healthcare brands, for example, some of those partnerships are a little bit tougher to envisage. We're looking at a number of partnerships right now. I can't jump into too many details, but certainly in the hair care space, around how we can start leveraging the opinion leaders in this space to be advocates for different ways of using our products. And this is a great opportunity for us to say, okay, so now that you are coming out to the new world, and you are thinking about how to look after your hair differently, here's these people then can become ambassadors for us, and that helps build trust. That helps tackle them at a time when they've been probably sort of underloving their hair, let's say, over all this time, and so they're open to new messages. So there are going to be some partnerships are going to be really, really helpful for us, but it's not going to be for every brand.
Yeah, and I guess there's the risk, isn't there, inherent in all of this, which you talked on beautifully, Yelena, which is that if you're not really careful, you can end up looking quite schizophrenic as a brand. You can start very quickly to look like you don't really know what you're focused on. I'm going to talk to you, Steve, about this brand schizophrenia question. It's a sort of a lack. Is it is it a lack of strategic focus that results in this sort of jumping from one trend to the next? Or is it a failure to use strategy as the lens through which you're making your decisions? What's causing it? Because we've seen it. What causes it in your mind?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, and I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists think about this. I think it's probably a combination of the two things, to be honest with you, Grant. The key point for me, I go back to what I said before, being able to sort of map out and fundamentally say, look, this is what we're trying to achieve as a brand. This is our growth strategy. This is where we're going. This is what we stand for. And then mapping out, well, around that, okay, what's going to impact that? What could positively or negatively influence that? What are some of these scenarios, as Yelena was talking about, some of the what ifs? And where do we prioritize? Where do we focus? So I think it's the need to do that process, but the need to sort of fit that in and stay flexible and adapt and react to everything that's going around at the same time. And, you know, fundamentally, that's not an easy thing to do. So I don't know there's an easy answer to that question, but I think it's a combination of factors.
Yeah, it's a theme we come back to in these conversations. I mean, we spoke with Tom Fishburne, the marketunist, on here not long ago, and he was talking about this sort of multiple hats issue that all these marketers are facing, and the fact that also they can walk in on a Monday morning or a Tuesday afternoon and be sort of doorstepped by a colleague and say, "Oh, have you seen this latest social network? What's our approach?" Yelena, how do you manage that? How do you stop and sort of say, "Look, let's take a moment and let's do this from the perspective of what we're aiming for in the medium and long term, rather than just jumping willy-nilly from one trend to the next"?
Well, again, it's a long-term objective. And we early on, with our amazing leadership, crafted a course for RB, for example, for Reckitt. And our whole compass and our overall corporate purpose became to protect, heal, and nurture in the relentless pursuit of cleaner, healthier world. So a lot of our programs and pretty much all our initiatives ladder up to that. It has to be obviously providing our consumers with the best products they can buy to live better lives, but it also has to be rooted in something very, very meaningful. And this is what Stephen talked about in his presentation as well. So as long as we stay the course and ladder up all our programs to what really matters, while bringing our retail partners along for the ride and for the journey with us, because a lot of these meaningful purpose-driven initiatives are also very near and dear to their hearts, this becomes a win-win long-term. And just a quick background behind me, even with Finish, where we advocate for skipping the rinse and saving water. This is very meaningful. And this is, again, something that is very relevant, both near term and long term.
Yeah. Megan, what's crucial in that answer, I think, from Yelena, is this leadership position that people have to have down. You know, how important is it that? Oh, actually, let me ask a slightly different question. How important has it been to use the access now that you and other marketers in our audience will have had to the C-suite in the last 15 months to really make sure that the strategy is being pushed through and that everything is being driven from a perspective of real consumer knowledge?
It's everything as of late, right? The question is spot on. In today's world, with so many things happening, it's easy to jump from project to project to project, or priority to priority. And having the voice of a strong leadership team and having that back within the organization to kind of like set things straight and stick to our primary goals, like Yelena was talking about. If it doesn't drive mental awareness, physical awareness, or household penetration at the end of the day, right, then everything needs to stop and we need to realign.
Yeah, and then sort of a slightly different take on where we're at the moment, but one of the things, and it may not be applicable to your brands and businesses, but one of the things we have seen is either an easing off the throttle or a mothballing or a sort of reduction in resource that's been attached to innovation, particularly, bizarrely, short-term innovation where people are looking to fill pipeline from September this year, for example. How important is it actually to say, you know, how are we ensuring that we're delivering products and services that match the needs of the consumers that we have today, but also that we're really planning for the needs that we're going to have come September, come January, come March? How have you been managing that?
So Sovos is lucky enough to be a very nimble organization. They were built strategically that way, with the idea that we take what we have in the moment and make sure we're taking full advantage of it. So I'm really proud to say I was part of a team that never stopped pushing in the middle of crisis mode, right? Instead of kind of taking a step back and seeing where the dust settled, we look for opportunities within the world and the environment in order to push through, right? Driving our same amount of promotion in order to capture those household penetrations and capture households that probably have never tried our brand before in different regions around the United States that are now looking for something new and exciting because they've been locked up at home, right? So at the same time, it goes for the long term as well. We never stopped innovating. We never stopped with our project pipelines. There were many hurdles and many challenges just because of outside forces, right? Because COVID did that to pretty much everything. But everything we're doing is still on track the way that was planned prior to COVID.
It's been really interesting. There was a piece written right back at the beginning, I think, of the crisis where everyone was focused on excess share of voice. I don't know if anyone came across all of those pieces about you've got to keep investing in your above the line salience because otherwise you'll disappear and you won't take advantage of your category growth. But hidden in amongst all of that research was a really important point about innovation, which was if you can't do the excess share of voice thing, or you can do the excess share of voice thing and you've got excess cash remaining, throw that at innovation pipelines, because that will be the thing that gets you out of jail when it comes to the end of the crisis or as we're coming out of the crisis. Michael, how have you been doing that with your kind of array of brands? I mean, I imagine there's a mixture of both sort of short-term, almost reactive innovation in terms of partnerships and service changes and slight format changes. And then there's that longer term piece. How are you balancing those two pieces up?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, I was going to comment, we didn't let up at all. In fact, actually, it drove more innovation for us and more thinking. Quite the opposite. We probably had too many ideas because we saw how consumers were using our products differently, the occasions they were applying them to differently. That gave us more insights around their needs and how we can better meet those with new formats or new formulations. So it was really quite the opposite. So that gave us a challenge around, okay, so is these innovations just for the short term, or do we believe that these are going to be addressing long-term changes and long-term needs as well? And that was a slightly trickier one to answer. We've, through looking at the research that we've had and how the behaviors have changed over time, we've managed to get a bit of a balance of both. The long-term pipeline projects, those have continued. As I mentioned before, the fundamental category growth drivers are still the same, and so you might just need to address them in slightly different ways. So we had a list of, here are the ones that need to come out pretty quick. We're going to focus time, resource, and attention on making sure that we're hitting the deadlines, that we are to meet consumers when they still have this need. And who knows, hopefully it will continue and this will be something that carries on. But some of the fundamental, some of the more fundamental changes, those have continued. And, we are, maybe the pacing has changed just slightly because of the hiccups, mainly in the retail trade. And they've been moving their reset dates, and there's a lot of turbulence there. So we're actually seeing a problem where we're seeing innovation stacking up because we've not been able to get it out there as quickly as we would like to. So no, we haven't paused for breath on the innovation side.
Yeah, it's a fundamental challenge, isn't it, that things are starting to stack across lots of different areas of our businesses. Emma, you'll be seeing this stacking in the way people are recruiting. They're looking for help, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a notable uptick in terms of people needing really good, strong innovation leaders. And I say the interesting, maybe the interesting sort of change in the requirements really is there's a real kind of need to focus on the mid to longer term innovation. The white space sort of roles, and so I guess now again we're coming to this sort of different stage in our thinking, and we've got a bit more of the luxury of time to think about how we can future-proof our businesses for the future, thinking further out, 5, maybe even 10 years. And I guess the other thing to note is, rather than just like the product innovation roles, in a lot of these job descriptions that I'm seeing, there's a lot around innovation in terms of sustainability, customer experience, direct distribution, AI, and digitalization sort of technologies as part of their pipelines, for example. So yeah, I would say that there's a definite need and a shortage of people with the right skills at the top end.
Oh, that's a really important point to sort of explore as a last sort of question, I think. So, Yelena, let's talk about the customer experience in its sort of holistic form. How important and how much time, I guess, have you invested in understanding the different potential scenarios for consumer journeys and consumer behaviors in the real world as restrictions ease? And how is that impacting your strategy around defending existing or accessing even new spend for some of your brands?
I think that this is an interesting new work stream that maybe we traditionally did not entertain. And I think many traditional CPGs will look at their category growth platforms and look at what are the growth pillars, what is going to get you there faster, how do you really, thought lead. But because our categories, many of them being commoditized or more stable, did not really require that out of the box thinking. And we were pretty much cruise controlling in some ways of during the 5-year and the next 5-year horizon. And then again, 5 years compressed into one, and COVID became a catalyst, not necessarily the change driver, but the key catalyst. And all of a sudden we realized that home became a hub and people looked at their health differently. And so our strategy needed to compress much faster. So I would say that right now it's almost a disproportionate focus for us to see how will we predict the future? What is that new crystal ball, but the one that actually is also very rational. And one thing I want to highlight is we're not doing this alone. We are actually employing our top vendor partners much more than we ever were. They became the natural extension of our teams, and we're relying much more heavily on the top ones to provide us with unique perspective, the new value adds, and the ones that provide the more unique approaches that are more affordable are the ones that are truly standing out and becoming those go-to research destinations for us. Early on, when the pandemic hit, there was at least temporary, the behavior that many CPGs froze their research or canceled it altogether. And, for sometimes the right reasons, that you cannot run your long-term investment research, such as your, usage and attitude study, for example, or a path to purchase. You just can't predict how things will change. But when we looked at this, we looked at the research opportunities as the opportunity to invest into the future. So when we called our research partners and they were ready to hear, stop all the trains, so to speak, we actually said, no, we're not stopping anything. If anything, we're leaning in, but let's discuss how we shift the research and what new questions we ask. And that became the differentiating early on factor that made us stand out.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think you're looking for those differentiating factors in the way that you conduct research, in the way that you then craft your strategy, and in the way that you then go to market. I was speaking to a marketer a couple of days ago who was saying that for their particular brand, which is a premium but not super premium brand, they were keeping an eye on the housing market because they were looking at the number of people who were upsizing their houses and adding garden rooms, because that gave them a sense of how frequently people might or might not be commuting in future. It's people using different sources of data from different areas, from third parties in a lot of ways, to enrich the story they have about their consumers that I think are really going to get ahead of this next consumer change. Thank you so much to this wonderful panel. I'm going to hand back to Steve now. Steve, if you wouldn't mind just summarizing a little bit of what we've discussed today and sort of talking about some of the steps that some of our audience might want to take as a result of what they've heard.
Sure, thanks, Geraint. So I think it's been a really interesting conversation, super useful. I think one of the things that stands out for me and goes back to what we've just been talking about around innovation, the need to innovate, is a couple of things. One, something Michael's talked about a lot around sort of the fundamentals. The fundamentals don't change. You need to have the fundamentals in place, understand your category growth drivers, understand your strategy, have, as Yelena was saying, that sort of North Star, that thing that we're all working towards. But at the same time, I think the other thing that has come up quite a lot in this conversation is the need to be forward thinking, the need to sort of have more agile, sort of nimble dips into the market to understand what's going on with your consumers and with your category. So, you know, for me, there's a few things that I think brands can think about as we look forward. In that sort of back to basics side, there's a few things. One, sort of know why you're useful. You know, explore new ways to deliver that utility as consumer needs, as behaviors change. Two, I think as we were just talking about, sort of demonstrating that value through the experience. So connecting the value that your products offer to the value that you offer as a business, all the way through the customer experience. And then also looking outside the comfort zone. I mean, you talked about this before, the opportunities that might exist in partnerships, in out-of-home occasions that maybe weren't there before but are now. On the other side of it, I think a few things that are really important. Forward thinking, looking ahead of the curve, just sort of mapping out those forces of chaos that I talked about previously, and prioritizing, you know, where do we want to focus? Where do we want to invest? What are our big bets for the future? And let's invest in those now. And really sort of heartening to hear across the whole panel that actually that focus on innovation hasn't dropped off over the last year or so. Also adapt and flow with the data. I think, Yelena, you've been talking about this a little bit, like, it's not just about that sort of moment in time big study anymore. It's about those sort of little views you can get that allow you to get a closer sense of what's evolving and what's changing, both in terms of your brand, the way it's perceived, but also your consumer and your target. And then finally, sort of getting out in front, sort of where and when consumers are and are going to be, mapping out those journeys and pinpointing the short and long-term opportunities to really sort of disrupt and offer that value and utility. So I'd say that's sort of my outcome or output of this. I would like to end on another history quote, because it's really rare that I get to do this these days, which is that, yes, we can't predict the future, but we can create it. And that is almost the best way to do it. And, you know, going back to what we've been talking about around innovation, around change, you know, I think sort of getting ahead, sort of trying to see around the corner, sort of placing those bets, both short-term and longer term now, is the best way to sort of predict what is going to happen moving forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve. That's it's always lovely to end with Abraham Lincoln. I can't really follow that. I'm going to say thank you, though, to a fantastic panel. Thank you, Yelena. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Emma. And thank you, Steve. And thank you to the audience for all coming to see us this afternoon. I'm conscious that kickoff for our English friends is 3 minutes away, so I won't keep you much longer. I will just say, as you're here, please do visit clearstrategy.com/events to look back at previous Clear conversations. And please also look out for an email from us in the next couple of days that will include both a recording of this session that you can go back to and listen again, or indeed read the article that Steve and our Chief Strategy Officer, Rhonda Hyatt, put together that talks about the specific issues that we've covered today that also will come to you in the next couple of days. And we'll look forward to seeing you at our next event starting in September. So please do look out for some emails from us in the coming weeks and months with new topics, new ideas, and new Clear conversations. So thank you so much to everyone, and enjoy the football. Goodbye.